I'm Meshal Malik and you're watching Indus Special. 2019 was a year in which climate change came at the forefront of global news. This year, climate wasn't just a conversation limited to environmentalists. It was talked about as being the biggest threat to our survival by politicians, scientists, and activists from all across the world. But underneath the talk and rhetoric, were the actions to fight climate change any different from the years before? On today's show, we take a look at how climate news unfolded in 2019. Joining us for this discussion, Mr. Svein Tveitdal, who is a climate expert and former UN director, joining us from Oslo. Also joining us today is Mr. Svein Harmeling, who is a climate policy expert at the CARE International Foundation, joining us from Bonn. Thank you both for joining us and welcome to the show. Mr. Tveitdal, let me begin with you. Now, do you think 2019 was significantly different as a year when we talk about climate change in conversation, in discourse, and also the events that unfolded than any year before?
Well, in a way, maybe there was a bigger wake-up on what is happening with the climate in 2019. We learned just 2-3 days ago that we are now setting a new emission record, a global one. We are now 4% higher than we had in Paris 4 years ago. And then parallel to this very, very dangerous development, we have seen a lot of awareness, not the least with Greta Thunberg and the millions of people that are in a way protesting on this all over the world. Like on Friday, there were 500,000 people marching for climate in Madrid. So there is a bigger wake-up, but the development is getting more dangerous. We are actually now heading towards a warming on 4 degrees if we don't do anything very fast.
Right. Mr. Harmeling, now, as Mr. Svein Tveitdal stated that we are heading towards a warming of 4 degrees. That's what some estimates are stating, between 3 degrees or 4 degrees if we continue as we are continuing to do so. What does that mean for the planet?
Actually, just to mention, today I'm talking from Madrid because I'm actually attending the UN Climate Summit. But coming back to your question, I think if we look at across the different scientific reports that have come out in the last years, like the IPCC reports, a 3 to 4 degrees increased world is a world which humanity has seen before, in which we struggle to imagine how to cope with that. I mean, so many things might change, like ocean currents might change. We may have totally different developments in terms of the monsoon systems, which different countries like in East and Southern Asia are used to. If we look at the kind of impacts we're already seeing today, with storms getting more severe at a level that, for example, scientists are discussing whether we need hurricane category 6 or even 7 because things are happening we haven't seen before. 3 to 4 degrees world would also mean a long-term complete melting of the Greenland ice sheet and probably significant parts of the Antarctic ice sheets, committing the future to several meters of sea level rise. And if we look at a world where more and more people live on the coast in large cities, I mean, it's just unimaginable what this would mean. So I think it's absolutely necessary now to really shift course, stop or let's say go beyond the rhetorics that climate action is important, but we really need to find the right measures in all countries, basically shift away from fossil fuels, invest into resilience measures. This is really emergency.
Right. And as Mr. Harmeling, you stated, and Mr. Tveitdal before stated as well, we need to go beyond the rhetoric, but we don't see that happening. We're going to discuss that in greater detail, but before that, I want to jump to Mr. Tveitdal and talk to him about this last comment that Mr. Harmeling stated, that we will find it more difficult to cope with in the near future if we continue on the course that we're walking on right now. But how are we finding it difficult to cope with the current scenarios? We've been seeing wildfires that have been aggravated by climate change. We are seeing sea levels rise all across the world, heat waves. Is it becoming difficult to cope with even now in the present day?
Well, of course, it gets more and more complicated and difficult to do so. We see now that the very modern societies like California and Australia cannot cope with the forest fires, for instance, because a combination of a drier land and more wind makes that difficult. And it is not strange that scientists have said that we need to stop at 2 degrees, because already now we have big problems with the coping with the consequences of the 1.1 degree warming we have had so far. And we will also now see that, for instance, the ice over the North Pole will most likely be ice-free in the summer, 10 to 40 years from now. Scientists say we here have passed the point of no return, which again with the albedo will add to the further warming of the planet. So all these signs makes it more expensive, more difficult, and more complicated to do what is needed to stop this very dangerous warming.
Right. Mr. Tveitdal, as you stated that we have hit a record of emissions in 2019, but according to the Global Carbon Project, these emissions have been growing at a slower rate than they were growing in 2018 and 2017. Can you attribute that slower growth rate to the conversation about climate change, the climate emergency we are in?
We have had these 4 degrees since Paris. Last year, in 2019 shows not that much as increase as we had in 2018. But if we listen, for instance, to the International Energy Fund, they are saying that the emissions will probably not be much less next year, or it will be at the level we have now for a few years more. And then it will not be possible to stop according to the global climate goals that, for instance, was agreed in Paris. You know, according to the report that came just a couple of weeks ago from UNEP, if we are going to stop at 1.5 degrees, we need a 7.6 decrease in emissions every year. And what we see is the opposite. We see that we have an increase. And next year, it will not be 7.6%, but then it will be 8 something, and then 9 something, and then it will be impossible. So the time squeeze we have is very, very complicated and brutal. And all those people that say we have to act now, they are extremely right. And this has the young people understood. And they understand now that if we don't do anything very fast, they will have a huge problem in the future for themselves and not the least their children by the end of the century.
Right. Mr. Harmeling, as Mr. Tveitdal stated, we have a time squeeze which is very complicated and very brutal. Young people seem to understand it, but we know that young people aren't the biggest problem behind the emissions we're seeing. It's big corporations, it's governments who are in control. What do you think is hindering still the reduction in emissions? We're seeing a continuous growth.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's, of course, also important to see that even the politicians and the corporations are run by people and humans. So in the end, it's also important that the kids put pressure on their parents in all the different forms. But of course, we know that there's certain system dynamics which make these stakeholders take certain decisions. I think on the one hand, there's still a massive political influence by fossil fuel corporations. And we've seen statistics and analyses in the last couple of years how much they still invest into lobbying, lobby efforts, which basically undermine the globally agreed Paris Agreement goals. I think that's one thing. We also still see that hundreds of billions of dollars, both in developed and developing countries, are subsidies to fossil fuel interests. And I think that's still a really big problem. On the other hand, I think there's also still an underestimation of the socio-economic benefits of the things we need to do to act on climate, whether it's renewable energies. There are positive developments, but by far not enough. But there, for example, if you talk about pollution in cities, in large cities in Asia or elsewhere, you cannot confront these problems without, for example, reducing the use of coal and shifting to renewable energies. But also in terms of resilience measures, there's a lot of co-benefits, and I think this is still underestimated, although there are a lot of activities happening here and there, but we are by far not yet at the transformative change scale we need.
Right. Mr. Harmeling, you stated here the influence that these fossil fuel companies, these corporations have on governments, how much they invest in lobbying. Until this discontinues or until this influence breaks, can we hope for a reduction in emissions in the future?
Well, I think it's, of course, something one needs to actively promote and actively find ways to reduce this influence. And I think there are also some positive developments here. I think it was last week when I read a news about some insurance companies who have started to announce that they will stop insuring coal power plants. And for example, if a company wants to build a new coal power plant and doesn't get insurance, then it's highly risky from a financial perspective. We're also seeing in more and more markets that renewable energies become cheaper than for example, coal power plants or other areas. And I think if more and more consumers, if more and more also cities, etc., let's say install frameworks which really help us shift away, then I think increasingly the power gets to the consumers and gets to the green forces, so to say. But it's something which needs to be actively taken on.
Right. Mr. Tveitdal, a lot of reports that are coming out in terms of giving recommendations to policymakers and to countries emphasize on the fact how there is a need, and especially in 2019, this emphasis was multiplied, that there is a need to take on the private sector on board. Do you feel like globally there was any move, there was any success in doing that, taking the private sector on board in trying to cut these emissions?
Yes, there is a global move, and there is currently a kind of fight between the green business and the fossil business. And I completely agree with Sven. I can, in a way, I wanted to add there that politicians, it is in their hand, for instance, to take away global subsidies on fossil energy and fuel, and it is tremendous amount. It is 6.5% of the global GNP that we are subsidizing the fossil fuels with. And if we took it away, it has been estimated that we immediately or shortly would reduce emissions by something between 25 and 30%. So this is politically possible, because you can take away subsidies without coming up with huge amount of money. And let me add that why they are so, in a way, desperate to take out the fossil energy now is that if we are going to stop at 2 degrees or less, almost 2/3 of the known reserves of coal, oil and gas has to be grounded. And physically, these fuels, they are in the ground, but economically, they are already taken up and they are in the balance of these global fossil companies. So it is they are, of course, doing what they can to in a way, save their values that they have already detected. So this fight will go on, and as of now, the fossil side is on the winning side, but they are slightly on retreat. So the opportunity for business is tremendous, because if we are going to do the green shift, it is the business that are going to implement the green shift.
Right.
So this is a tremendous opportunity, but the politicians need to help with the right decision, because the market is not solving this, the problem on short notice.
Right. Mr. Tveitdal, as you stated, politicians need to step in. Now, I'd like to quote the example of Brazil and France in this regard, where Brazil was strong-armed in many ways by France and other European countries to take a hold of the Amazon fires, or else trade would be impacted. Now, one of the conversations that needs to be had is the lack of accountability amongst countries when they go towards subsidizing fossil fuels, when they continuously have an increase in emissions. Is there any mechanism, or are we seeing a move towards politics intervening and putting pressure on more green environmental policies?
I think we need to do two things. One thing is that, first of all, there need to be a global movement. I happen to be the chair of the Norwegian Rainforest Association, and we are working all the time to do something with this. So this pressure helps. But then we also need to provide funding from the rich countries, which, for instance, Norway is doing, so that it is more, you cannot blame a poor person that is cutting a tree to survive. So we need to make it possible for people in the rainforest to make money on saving the forest instead of the opposite. So we have to go in with funding, but in addition to that, we then need to be tough politically towards countries like Brazil and Indonesia if they're not doing anything with stopping this illegal logging.
Right. Mr. Harmeling, Mr. Tveitdal stated something very essential here about the need for funding, and I want to get to that, but before that I want to also get to something he mentioned about putting pressure on countries such as Brazil, Indonesia, but look at the United States, arguably the most powerful country in the world. Look at the stance of their president and look at the emissions that they are contributing in the global increase in emissions. In this, does it even matter if you continue to strong arm little countries, developing countries, and not take strict action against developed nations?
Well, I think in principle, it's not necessarily one or the other. But of course, when we are, for example, talking about Brazil, we're talking about one of the G20 countries, right? And so it's not about a small developing countries. I also see, and I've heard it here in the UN Climate Summit in Madrid as well, that it's basically smaller developing countries like least developed countries, island states, who are basically pledging more ambitious steps in terms of their own climate policies. This is not significant from a global emissions perspective, but it's politically important. In terms of the US, I think the strategy must be to work with all those progressive forces in the countries that are there. In the UN Climate Summit here in Madrid, a delegation from progressive US business and lawmakers was here. The representative of the House, Nancy Pelosi, was here. So to show that even if the Trump administration itself wants to pull out of Paris, this is not something which is accepted in the US, and that the US plays an active force. So I think we need to work everywhere with the progressive forces and help them wherever they can. And as the colleague said, international funding is one key ingredient into that.
Right. Mr. Tveitdal, when we're talking about international funding, in 2019, did we see an increase, a replenishment of the Green Climate Fund? Did we see countries contributing more to it to help developing nations survive?
It looks like the progress of this initiative is not very promising, and we are struggling with paying $100 billion a year to developing countries, while the money we use on subsidizing our fossil energy is much, much, much higher. So if we are not turning this around, we will continue with this dramatic development where we will see a global warming that is almost impossible to cope with for the next 2 generations.
And Mr. Tveitdal, when we're saying that, seeing an optimistic picture about funding, when we talk about funding, what do you feel like are the main hindrances here in capacity building in this regard, providing funding?
Well, I think the overall most important thing now is ambitions. We need to increase ambitions with funding, with reduction of emissions. And next year in Glasgow, that is 5 years after Paris. And then countries will take stock and come up with new ambitions. And but we cannot wait year for year. So we of course hope that these ambitions will be higher next year, but so far countries are lagging behind even what they promised in Paris. So it was like what Greta Thunberg said in Madrid on Friday, that we cannot wait another year. We need to work. We need to start working tomorrow. The pressure that is built up by those who want action is getting stronger, and that is the hope for the future. The fight is difficult, but it's something we have to win very fast if we are going to leave the planet in a good shape for our children and grandchildren.
Right. Mr. Harmeling, the planet we live on is, of course, worth saving. I mean, for all the pictures that we see about climate change, we also see many pictures of sunsets, sunrises, and we look at it, and of course, it's something to marvel over. Right now, at the pace we're going, do you think we can turn back from the damage we have done already?
Well, and I think I would like to add, we shouldn't forget that so far it's the only planet we're able to live on. There's no other alternatives, and that's real reality. I mean, I think we have to confront a near future where we know that further losses and damages, it's also a term which is used here in the climate negotiations, is going to happen, and that is something which also vulnerable countries, poor countries, need to be supported with. I think there are still many good, promising initiatives happening on the ground, and if we manage to bring together all these forces, the youth moving, the progressive business sector, many communities going in the right direction, and really accelerate those forces, I think there's still a good chance of. I'm not talking a good chance doesn't mean a certain percentage here, but we can still shift course rapidly, and I think there's no alternative to this, and I hope that in the next months, really, and that's what Mr. Tveitdal also talked about, that in the next months within the countries, the work on advancing the national climate plans is really stepping up, and it's about delivering them already next year. And when we come next year to the climate summit in Glasgow at the end of the year, this is then already the point when these steps must have happened, and it's more about then coming together and understanding, okay, how far have we progressed, but the discussions on the progress and the ambition increase has to happen now and basically in the next months. And but of course it's not only about longer term plans, it's about the immediate actions that can be taken everywhere.
Right, on that point, we're in this segment. Thank you to both my guests for joining us, Mr. Svein Tveitdal from Oslo and Mr. Svein Harmeling from Madrid. We're going to go for a short break. When we return, we talk about how climate change has played out in South Asia in 2019. Stay with us. Welcome back to the show. South Asia is one of the most adversely impacted regions of the world when we talk about climate change. Well, what makes this region so vulnerable, and how has the global climate emergency played out in this region in 2019? We take a closer look at this in detail. Joining us for this discussion is Mr. Syed Abubakar, who's an award-winning environmental journalist by the Singapore Environmental Council. He also writes on climate change and sustainability. He's joining us here in the Lahore studios. Also joining us is Mr. Omair, Ahmad, who is the managing editor of South Asia at thethirdpole.net. He joins us from New Delhi. Thank you both for joining us, and welcome to the show. Mr. Abubakar, I'd like to begin with you. Now, we live in Pakistan, and it is being ranked as the 5th most vulnerable country to climate change. But what makes this entire region so vulnerable to the climate emergency we're seeing globally?
So it's regarding our geographical position. We are placed in a region that is more susceptible to droughts, to heat wave impacts, to flooding events, and then it comes our infrastructure, that our investments in the infrastructures, they are not climate resilient. It is only until now that the government has decided that they are going to climate proof every project to ensure that whatever investment is done is sustainable and does not harm the people. And what unfortunately is now happening is that government, the previous government, in fact, as part of the mega projects, they have installed coal-fired power plants all across the country. Some are under construction, some have already been constructed. So these coal power plants are going to increase our emissions. Our emissions in the global carbon trajectory are less than 1%. We are on the 135th position in terms of emissions as compared with the world, but we are the most vulnerable. So the point is that now as we plan to increase our emissions, that can possibly further increase our vulnerability. So from the 5th position, we can go to the 3rd or 2nd or the 1st position.
And how does that happen? If we're so vulnerable because of the global emissions, we're contributing so less to it. But if we increase our emissions a little bit, we become more vulnerable. Is it a local issue? Is it a global issue? What is impacting our change in position?
So we have to take this situation in a holistic manner. We need to fully realize this fact that the emissions of the United States, of Europe, of other developed countries and the world, they are going to impact us. So it's a global problem. So the point is that the global countries, the global world, they have to build the capacity of the vulnerable countries. And in this regard, there's the Green Climate Fund, the Adaptation Fund, and the Global Environment Facility, that they should be furthermore contributing to build the vulnerability.
And I'm going to jump to all these funds and what the international community is doing in regard to actually donating and actually giving money to these. But before that, I want to jump to Mr. Ahmad and talk to him about this vulnerability that I was discussing with Mr. Abubakar. Now, we're seeing more severe weather-related disasters, climate-related disasters. How has it been in 2019 for South Asia, if we look at it as an overview?
Well, the current UN COP is happening right now in Madrid. And the scientists at that point said very bluntly, 2019 has been a bad year for humanity. And that is true of South Asia as well. You have to understand that South Asian civilization is a monsoon civilization. The monsoon has been critical to our farming patterns for thousands of years. And climate change is disrupting those climate patterns. 50% of the populace across South Asia is somehow dependent on agriculture to make their livelihoods. And when that is disrupted, the most vulnerable sections of our society are hit the worst. And this shows up in droughts, in floods, in wastage of crops that are long-standing, and in numerous other ways of that. The other thing is the Indian Ocean is the warmest ocean in the world. And what we're seeing is a global rise in the level of oceans and huge, very vulnerable communities along the coastline across South Asia being affected the most. And these are often the poorest people. So they have the least scope to respond to these things.
Right. Mr. Ahmad, as you stated here, water, we're seeing patterns change, we're seeing monsoon patterns change, and water that is a precious necessity for agriculture. We're also seeing that shift. Many countries are becoming more water scarce. Now, in all of this, for a very long time, climate was divorced from the economic aspects of a nation. Did we see in 2019 in this region a conversation which talked about economic policies in light of the climate change we're seeing?
Not enough, frankly. And that's because development in South Asia has largely been either state-driven or by large corporations which are closely tied to the state. And that has meant that the response to a lot of drought and other issues has been to build large infrastructure, such as dams and stuff like that. When actually, if you look at traditional practices of small pond, those are the ones that have let little villages be far more resilient to the impacts. And that hasn't been focused enough. And we have to change from a very centralized, either in a Delhi or a Dhaka-driven approach, to a much more regional, in fact, district up approach. And that change is still not happening because most of the big money and most of the big decision makers are still very centralized.
Mr. Ahmad, do you also share that view that Mr. Ahmad just stated, that our approaches, the policies are so centralized, and that's why we're not seeing enough resilience across the region?
Yes, I fully agree with Omair Sahab. The reason being that bureaucratic hurdles, having a more centralized approach, and the inability of the provinces to cope with environmental disasters is a major hurdle. The reason being that their technical capacity needs to be enhanced. I would like to refer to an example. It's the GCF-funded project known as GLOF2, funded by the being implemented by the Ministry of Climate Change and the provincial environment protection agencies of Gilgit-Baltistan and Khyber Pakhtunkhwa. So that project was planned to start in 2017, but it began after a gap of a year or more than that. The reason being that there are bureaucratic hurdles, and in such projects being commissioned and then they have to be implemented, the poor vulnerable people, they are still waiting for help. They're waiting for someone that can help them to develop early warning systems and enhance their capacity to deal with such events.
Right. Now, You've mentioned funding here, and in the previous segment, we also discussed this in great detail, how the funds that were pledged in Copenhagen as well to support developing nations cope with climate change, they aren't moving in an optimistic manner. What impact does that have, the lack of funds being given globally to this part of the region? So
in the German Watch Global Climate Risk Index 2020, Pakistan was ranked on 5th position and lost $3.8 billion in this 20-year period. So the point is that the global world, which they have pledged that they're going to contribute $100 billion for the GCF, they haven't done that. The countries such as Canada, Germany, they are contributing, but they are not contributing at the pace that is actually required. Right. So if they are not contributing, our vulnerability is going to increase. One of the reasons being that the world has already crossed the 1 degree Celsius threshold, and as part of the Paris Agreement, we aimed to limit it to 1.5 degrees, ideally to 1.5 degrees or to 2 degrees Celsius. So if this climate finance is not coming in, the global temperatures are going to further increase, and so will the vulnerability.
Right. Mr. Ahmad, now, if we try to take regional action, is that enough in the state of climate emergency that we are in right now? Will it be enough to actually stop the problems that we're seeing unfold in South Asia?
No. We're already in a climate emergency, and no matter what we do now, for the next 20 years or so, we are going to face the outcomes of actions that happened over the last 200 years. And that's a problem we now already have to live with. We have to adapt and we have to have the adaptation mechanisms, because it took a long time for us to get to this crisis. And that crisis isn't going to disappear in 2 days. It doesn't matter what we do now. So right. Adaptation has to be part of that. And the other blunt fact is that rich countries seem to have no interest at all in actually taking responsibility for the problems that are largely of their creation. I mean, 200 years is a long time. None of the developing world was contributing this much pollution to that. That said, we don't have a choice. We can't wait for that. We can't continue to negotiate hoping somehow funds will come into place. I mean, $100 billion was supposed to be put in by the developed world. Last year, climate change induced damage in India alone would have cost us more than that. Just $100 billion straight out loss. Right. Now, so the thing is, how do we work in a way that is both adaptive and which strengthens local economies? And for a lot of that, the solutions are going to be in smaller areas, in the mountain areas. Like, for example, Bhutan, because of its small size, is able to focus much more closely on the problems. It is now South Asia's leading state when it relates to GLOF events. And we need to think that, and Bhutan has a population of 800,000. We need that kind of focus. But unfortunately, the decision makers are sitting in different places. Right. And we need to have a complete shift in how we're making those decisions, because we have to look at the profitability of, let's say, the coastline, of looking at the blue economy. And that means cleaning up the coastline, but it also means greater profits for fishermen and for the countries at large. We have to look at mountain economies, look at horticulture, look at saving those spaces, but also trying to find ways that actually drives development in the region, rather than just building these huge infrastructure projects that make us more and more vulnerable.
Right. Abubakar, do you feel like in Pakistan specifically, let's talk about this case, do you feel like there is a realization that sustainable development can happen, but in a sustainable manner?
There is a growing urge by the current government that they are investing in large projects, green projects. They are coming up with greater ideas. So they have come up with an idea that they are going to electrify the vehicles, and a significant component, 30% would be electric by 2030. So they do understand that they have to be in line with the global priorities. But the pace at which this should happen is slow. The reason being that we don't have the finances to shift completely to a low carbon economy. And then the dichotomy that on one hand we have coal power plants and on the other hand we are going for development, I don't think that we are going to progress in the manner that we are supposed to.
And you also stated this target. Now, this is also a global target. Sustainable Development Goals also hit 2030 as the year that they want to develop towards. But is this year too far away when we're talking about it's 10 years away now? We're talking about these measures we're taking, but will it be too late by then?
I think it's going to be already too late because at 1 degree Celsius of global temperature rise above pre-industrial levels, and that we have to stay within the 2 degrees Celsius threshold, and the intensity of extreme weather events that we are witnessing, that Turbat in Balochistan witnessed 53.5 degrees Celsius temperature in 2017, which was extremely high. In Nawabshah, there was over 50 degrees Celsius temperature, which was one of the highest temperatures ever measured last year. So the thing is that the pace at which we have to excel is, it's far greater, and the developed world should assist us. One of the good things is that Pakistan has been selected as the co-chair for 1 year in 2020 at GCF. So we believe in and we hope that by having this the co-chairship of GCF, we might be able to come in with good projects for Pakistan.
Right. That is something that is worth, of course, looking into and being optimistic about, but we have to do more. Mr. Ahmad, now, the World Health Organization states that 90% of the population in South Asia specifically is breathing in toxic air. We know that climate change will also exacerbate the health issues we're seeing. What are some of the meaningful policies that can be implemented to protect the most vulnerable communities in all of this?
So for South Asia, primarily the health things will be heat related, right? I mean, there is going to be some cold related issues, but heat is the biggest problem because once you reach the 50 degrees centigrade threshold, working in that temperatures is really difficult. There are certain good initiatives. I mean, there's the Urban Forest Initiative, which I think is in Karachi and one part in Punjab. You need to make sure that your urban infrastructure has green spaces in it. Otherwise, what you have is too much cement, and that means the heat of the cities creates these very high peaks, and that means primarily poor people who cannot get off the road, who don't have a chance to take a break in the middle of the day, who have to earn money, are the ones that are going to be dying of heat stroke. In India, Ahmedabad came up with a very good urban heat planning, heat plan. Other cities across South Asia will have to adopt very smart heat plans. But if you keep building infrastructure in such a way that you just put cement everywhere, you're going to run into big trouble. I mean, Delhi is already in a huge problem area, and it will continue to be so for at least a decade. This air pollution problem isn't going to disappear. We have to think of better ways to plan out for this.
Right. And the central point, I mean, one of the central points that Mr. Ahmad, you have stressed on is adaptation and how we can do that. Now, I think this point is, of course, worth going into a little more detail in. How can we plan our cities better in order to, if not mitigate, but at least cope with what we're seeing happening?
So very simply, most cities are by water because water is necessary for life. And unfortunately, what has happened in most South Asian cities is they've expanded over the wetlands and over the water areas, constricting both rivers, as well as destroying any wetlands that could absorb water in the case of floods and which regulate the heat of the city. Now, you can expand the city in ways that retain some of those wetlands. And that allows a link between the urban and the rural areas, which has traditionally been a way that South Asian cities have had, like weekly farm markets, the heart as a particular aspect of how cities have expanded. India's had this 100 smart cities plan, and we'll see how that goes. But basically, a large part of our problem is our urban infrastructure. It has to be expanded in a way that keeps green spaces viable and that intersperses the city with both wetlands and green spaces. A lot of cities are already critically bad at that, but we can maybe plan better for the future.
Right. Mr. On that point of trying to make communities more resilient, I do want to end on this one specific point. Now, Oxfam also has stressed on the displacement. A report came out and talked about the displacement of people being caused, and a large amount of those displaced people in the world will be belonging to Asia. How can we make our countries more resilient in order to deal with the displacement? I mean, people are being forced out of their homes. What can be done at a policy level, at a governmental level, in order to help and cope with that? So
displacement can be, very nicely be said as climate-induced migration. So I witnessed climate-induced migration in 2015 when I went to report on the matter in Dagut Valley in Gilgit-Baltistan, where communities were forced to leave because of the increase in the intensity and frequency of extreme weather events. So what needs to be done is that our policies need to be more conclusive. They shouldn't be, drafted by one secretary or a minister, and it's not highlighting what's actually happening on the ground. It should be conclusive by having the views of civil society representative, of the experts. And then it's the responsibility of the provincial departments, of the provincial environment protection departments. And climate change is a cross-cutting subject. Now it's impacting agriculture, it's impacting businesses. So all of the departments, the ministries, they have to sit together and come down with a plan that how will it benefit the people? It's the people at the heart of the entire agenda.
Right, and that is the point I'm going to end the show on, that it's the people that are at the heart of everything that we're seeing. I mean, economy, everything, as climate, the conversation continues. These are important realms to focus on, but it is the person and the individual that we need to focus on. On that point, thank you so much, Mr. Syed Mohammed Abubakar, for joining us in the Lahore studios, and Mr. Omair Ahmad for joining us from New Delhi. Thank you for watching Indus Special. We will see you again next time with more stories. Till then, goodbye and take care.